The concert hall in Vienna was one of those places that made you feel small. Not in a bad way. More like standing at the edge of the ocean or looking up at mountains that have been there for millions of years. The ceilings stretched so high that voices got lost somewhere in the middle. The walls were covered in gold decorations that had been polished by hundreds of hands over hundreds of years. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the red velvet seats. Every night, some of the greatest musicians in the world stood on that stage. Violinists who had trained since they were 3 years old, singers whose voices could make grown men cry, pianists whose fingers moved so fast they looked like a blur. And every night, after the last guest had left and the last lights had dimmed, a 63-year-old man named Roberto Oliveira pushed his cleaning cart through those same golden doors. Roberto had worked at the concert hall for 11 years. He knew every corner of that building better than he knew his own small apartment. He knew which floorboards creaked near the third row of seats. He knew that the bathroom on the second floor always had a leaky faucet, no matter how many times they fixed it. He knew that pigeons liked to nest in the small gap behind the statue of Beethoven near the main entrance. But most of all, he knew the piano. It sat in the center of the stage like a king on his throne, a Steinway Model D, built in 1927. The body was made of polished ebony that reflected the stage lights like a mirror. The keys were real ivory, yellowed slightly with age, but still smooth as silk. When the lid was open, you could see the golden strings inside, stretched tight and waiting to sing. Roberto had cleaned around that piano more times than he could count. He dusted the legs, he polished the pedals. He wiped down the bench where so many famous musicians had sat. But he never touched the keys. Never. Not once in 11 years. The other cleaners thought he was just being careful. The piano was worth more than most houses. One scratch, one spill, and you could lose your job faster than you could say sorry. So they understood why Roberto kept his distance, but that was not the real reason. The real reason was something Roberto had buried so deep inside himself that most days he almost forgot it was there. Almost. Because every night, when the hall was empty and dark, when his mop made soft, swishing sounds against the marble floor, he would stop near the stage. He would look at that piano, and for just a moment, his hands would tremble. Not from cold, not from age, from memory. Roberto had not always been a cleaner. He had not always worn a faded blue uniform with someone else's name stitched on the pocket because the company had run out of new ones. He had not always been invisible. 45 years ago, in a small village in Portugal, there was a boy who could do something extraordinary. His name was Roberto, and he could make a piano sing. His family was poor. His father worked in the fishing boats, leaving before sunrise and coming back after sunset, smelling like salt and exhaustion. His mother cleaned houses for rich families in the city, taking a bus for 2 hours each way just to scrub floors and wash dishes. They lived in a house with 2 rooms, a leaky roof, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbors arguing about money every single night. But in the corner of their small living room sat an old upright piano. It had belonged to Roberto's grandmother, who had died before he was born. Nobody in the family could play it. His father wanted to sell it for extra money, but his mother refused. It was the only thing she had left of her own mother. So it sat there, gathering dust, taking up space they did not have. One day, when Roberto was 5 years old, he walked up to that piano and pressed a key. The sound that came out was slightly out of tune, a bit broken, but to Roberto it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He pressed another key, then another. Within an hour, he was picking out a melody he had heard on the radio. His mother came home to find him still sitting there, his small fingers moving across the keys like they had been doing it forever. She stood in the doorway and cried. Not sad tears, the other kind. Word spread quickly in a small village. The fishing family's boy was special. He could play songs after hearing them just once. He could make up melodies that sounded like they belonged in fancy concert halls, not in a tiny house with a leaky roof. A music teacher from the city heard about him. She drove 2 hours just to listen to this boy everyone was talking about. When Roberto finished playing for her, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she looked at his parents and said 4 words that would change everything. "He is a genius." She offered to teach him for free. She said it would be a crime to let talent like this go to waste. She said he could be one of the great ones, the kind of pianist who comes along once in a generation. And so Roberto's new life began. For the next 12 years, he practiced 6 hours a day, sometimes more. His fingers would ache so badly that he had to soak them in warm water just to move them. He missed birthday parties. He missed football games with other boys his age. He missed being normal. But he did not mind because when he sat at the piano, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. At 17, he won a national competition. At 19, he won an international one. The newspapers called him the Pride of Portugal. They put his picture on the front page, this skinny kid with messy hair and hands that could create miracles. Record companies started calling. Concert halls across Europe sent invitations. Everyone agreed that Roberto Oliveira was going to be a star. And then, one cold November night, everything fell apart. Roberto did not like to think about that night. Even now, 45 years later, the memory felt like touching a hot stove, quick, sharp pain that made him pull back before he could even understand what happened. His wife, his daughter, the headlights coming toward them too fast. He never played again after that. Not once. He could not. Every time he looked at a piano, he saw their faces reflected in the polished wood. Every time he heard music, he heard his daughter's laugh, the way she used to clap her tiny hands when he played her favorite songs. The piano had given him everything. And then life had taken everything away. So he disappeared. He left Portugal. He left music. He left behind the boy who was going to be a star and became just another man trying to survive. He worked in factories. He washed dishes in restaurants. He picked grapes in vineyards. He did whatever it took to keep moving, to keep from standing still long enough for the memories to catch up. Eventually, he ended up in Vienna, the city of music. Some people might call that ironic. Roberto called it punishment, or maybe penance. He was never sure which. Getting the job at the concert hall was an accident. He had applied to clean offices in the building next door. They were full, but the concert hall needed someone. He almost said no, almost walked away. But something stopped him. Maybe he was tired of running. Maybe he wanted to be close to the thing he had lost, even if he could never have it back. So every night, Roberto Oliveira cleaned the most beautiful concert hall in Vienna. He swept the floors where audiences had given standing ovations. He emptied trash cans filled with programs that had famous names printed on them. He polished the brass railings that hands had gripped in excitement, and he stayed invisible. Just another cleaner. Just another old man that nobody noticed. Until the night that Alexander Richter came to town. Alexander Richter was the kind of man who walked into a room and expected everyone to notice. And they always did. It was impossible not to. He was tall, with sharp cheekbones and silver hair that he wore slicked back like a movie star from the old days. His suits were custom-made in Milan. His shoes were handcrafted in London. His watch cost more than most people earned in a year. But it was not the clothes or the hair or the expensive watch that made people stare. It was the way he carried himself, like the whole world was a stage and everyone else was just background noise. At 36 years old, Alexander Richter was one of the most famous pianists alive. He had played at Carnegie Hall in New York when he was just 22. He had performed for presidents and kings and queens. Critics used words like extraordinary and once in a generation and historic when they wrote about him. His recordings had sold millions of copies around the world, and he knew it. Oh, how he knew it. Some artists are humble. They remember where they came from. They stay grateful for their gifts. Alexander was not one of those artists. He had been told he was special since he was 4 years old, and he had believed it every single day since. Why wouldn't he? The whole world kept proving it was true. When his European tour brought him to Vienna, Alexander was not happy about it. Yes, the concert hall was beautiful. Yes, it had history. Beethoven himself had performed there 200 years ago. But to Alexander, it felt small. He had played in bigger halls, grander venues, more important cities. Vienna was just another stop on a tour that had too many stops already. He arrived 3 days before his performance, which was more time than he usually gave any city. But his manager had insisted. "Rest," she said. "Prepare. Make sure everything is perfect." Alexander did not need 3 days to prepare. He had been playing piano since before he could read. He could perform his entire concert program in his sleep. But fine. If they wanted him to stay, he would stay. He would use the time to rehearse in the actual hall, to get the feel of the piano, to make sure the acoustics met his standards. On the first day of rehearsals, Alexander walked into the concert hall like he owned it. His team followed behind him, a small army of assistants and managers and sound engineers. They carried his things, they took his coat, they brought him water at exactly the right temperature, not too cold, not room temperature, but perfectly chilled. The hall's director greeted him at the door, practically bowing. "Mr. Richter, it is such an honor to have you here. If there is anything you need, anything at all, please do not hesitate to ask." Alexander barely looked at him. "The piano. I want to see it." They led him to the stage. There it was, the Steinway Model D, sitting under the lights like it had been waiting for him. Alexander walked around it slowly, examining it from every angle. He ran his finger along the edge, checking for dust. He lifted the lid and looked at the strings. He sat down on the bench and played a few scales, listening carefully to each note. "It will do," he said finally. "Not good, not excellent, just, it will do." The director let out a breath he had been holding. "Wonderful. We had it tuned just yesterday, but if you would like, we can have the tuner come back and—" "That won't be necessary." Alexander was already playing, his fingers moving through a complicated piece like it was nothing. The music filled the empty hall, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling and the rows of empty seats. It was beautiful. Even the assistants, who had heard him play 1,000 times, were stopped to listen. That was when Alexander noticed the old man. He was standing near the back of the hall, holding a mop and a bucket. A cleaner, obviously. His uniform was faded and slightly too big for him. His hair was gray and thin. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from years of hard work and harder memories. But it was not his appearance that caught Alexander's attention. It was the way he was standing. His eyes were closed, his head was tilted slightly to one side, and he was swaying, just barely, moving with the music like it was flowing through his body. Alexander stopped playing. The sudden silence made everyone look up. "You there!" Alexander called out. His voice echoed in the empty hall. "Old man, what are you doing?" Roberto's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he looked confused, like he had been somewhere far away and was suddenly pulled back to reality. He looked around and realized that everyone was staring at him. The assistants, the director, and the famous pianist on the stage, looking down at him with an expression that was hard to read. "I am sorry, sir," Roberto said quietly. "I was just cleaning. I did not mean to disturb." "You weren't disturbing me." Alexander's tone was strange, not angry exactly, more like curious, and something else, something that looked almost like irritation. "You were listening, really listening. Most people don't do that." Roberto did not know what to say. He gripped his mop tighter and looked at the floor. Do you know anything about music? Alexander asked. Or do you just like the pretty sounds? The director stepped forward nervously. Mr. Richter, I apologize. The cleaning staff usually works at night. I don't know why he's here during rehearsals. I asked him a question. Alexander did not look away from Roberto. Well, do you know anything about this instrument? Or is it just furniture to you? Something flickered in Roberto's eyes. A spark of something old, something buried. He looked up at the piano, at the beautiful Steinway that he had cleaned around for 11 years. And before he could stop himself, the words came out. It is a Steinway Model D built in 1927, not 1923 as most people think. The serial number is in the 200,000 range, which means it was made in the New York factory, not Hamburg. The soundboard is spruce, and if you listen carefully, you can hear a slight warmth in the lower register that is unique to instruments from that era. It has been restored at least twice, probably in the 60s, and again in the 90s. The current strings are new, replaced within the last 5 years, and the action has been adjusted to be slightly lighter than the original specifications, which means it responds faster but loses some of the depth in fortissimo passages. The hall went completely silent. Alexander stared at him. The director stared at him. The assistants stopped what they were doing and stared at him. Roberto felt his face go red. He had said too much. Way too much. 45 years of silence, and now this. He tightened his grip on the mop and looked back down at the floor. I should go, he mumbled. I am sorry for interrupting. He turned and walked toward the back exit as fast as he could without running. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. What had he done? Why had he said all of that? He had spent so long being invisible, and now, in one stupid moment, he had shown more than he had shown anyone in decades. Behind him, Alexander watched him go. The irritation on his face had been replaced by something else now. Interest, suspicion, and the beginning of a plan. Who is that man? He asked the director, his eyes still on the door where Roberto had disappeared. Just a cleaner, sir. Roberto something. He has worked here for many years. Very quiet. Keeps to himself. I really am sorry about this. It won't happen again. No. Alexander smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found a new toy to play with. Don't apologize. I think things just got a lot more interesting. The director did not understand what he meant. But he felt a chill run down his spine anyway. 3 days. That was how long Alexander had until his performance. 3 days to figure out who this old cleaner really was. 3 days to understand why a man with a mop knew more about pianos than most professional musicians. And 3 days to decide what to do about it. Alexander Richter did not like mysteries. He did not like feeling surprised or confused or outsmarted. And something about that old man, something about the way he had talked about the piano, about the look in his eyes when the music played, it bothered him. It was like looking at a locked door and not having the key. But Alexander always got what he wanted. Always. And right now, he wanted to know what Roberto was hiding. The night of the concert arrived faster than anyone expected. Outside the concert hall, a line of black cars dropped off guests in elegant gowns and tailored suits. Women wore diamonds around their necks. Men adjusted their bow ties in the reflection of the glass doors. Everyone wanted to look their best. After all, this was not just any performance. This was Alexander Richter. Inside, the hall buzzed with excitement. 2,000 seats and every single one was filled. Critics from major newspapers sat in the front rows with notebooks and pens ready. Television cameras were set up in the back, ready to broadcast the performance live to millions of viewers around the world. The tickets had sold out in 11 minutes. Some people had paid 5 times the original price just to be there. Roberto stood in the shadows near the back entrance, watching the crowd fill in. He should not have been there. His shift did not start until after the concert ended, when everyone was gone and the hall was empty again. But something had pulled him here tonight, something he could not explain. For 3 days, he had tried to avoid Alexander Richter. He came to work earlier. He left later. He stayed in parts of the building where the famous pianist would never go. But it did not matter. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way Alexander had looked at him. That smile. Those cold, curious eyes, like a cat watching a mouse. Roberto knew that smile. He had seen it before, a long time ago, on the faces of people who thought they were better than everyone else. People who used others for entertainment, for sport, for their own amusement. He had hoped that Alexander would forget about him, that the famous pianist would move on to more important things. But deep down, Roberto knew better. Men like Alexander Richter did not forget. The lights in the hall began to dim. The crowd grew quiet. A hush fell over the room. That special kind of silence that only happens before something big. Roberto pressed himself further into the shadows, making himself as small as possible. Then Alexander walked onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet before he had even played a single note. Alexander smiled and waved, soaking in the adoration like sunlight. He was wearing a black suit that probably cost more than Roberto earned in 6 months. His silver hair gleamed under the stage lights. He looked like a king entering his throne room. But instead of sitting down at the piano, Alexander walked to the front of the stage. He raised his hand, and the applause slowly died down. People looked at each other, confused. This was not part of the program. What was happening? "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said into the microphone, his voice smooth as honey. "Thank you for that wonderful welcome. Before we begin tonight's performance, I would like to do something a little different, something special." The audience murmured with curiosity. The cameras zoomed in on his face. "As many of you know, I have dedicated my life to music, to the piano, to the pursuit of perfection." Alexander paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But music is not just for people like me. Music belongs to everyone, even those we might not expect." Roberto felt his stomach drop. No, 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 no. "A few days ago, I met someone here at this very concert hall, a cleaner, a janitor, a man who mops these floors and empties the trash cans." Alexander's smile grew wider. "But when I spoke to him, I discovered something surprising. This man knows more about pianos than most musicians I have met. He spoke about this very instrument with knowledge and passion that shocked me." The audience laughed nervously. They were not sure where this was going. Neither was Roberto. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. "So I thought, why not give him a chance? Why not let him show us what he knows?" Alexander turned and looked toward the back of the hall. His eyes scanned the shadows until they found exactly what they were looking for. Roberto. "There he is," Alexander said, pointing. A spotlight swung around and landed directly on Roberto, blinding him with white light. He threw up his hand to shield his eyes, but it was too late. Everyone was looking at him now. 2,000 faces turned in his direction. Cameras pivoted to capture him. "Come on up," Alexander called out, his voice filled with mock encouragement. "Don't be shy. Come show us what you've got." The audience began to clap, but it was not the warm applause they had given Alexander. It was uncertain, confused, with whispers underneath. Who was this old man? What was happening? Was this some kind of joke? Roberto stood frozen. His legs would not move. His mind was screaming at him to run, to disappear, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But the spotlight held him in place like a cage. His supervisor appeared beside him, face red with panic. "What did you do?" he hissed. "You need to leave. Now, before this gets worse." But before Roberto could respond, Alexander spoke again. "I insist," he said, and there was something harder in his voice now, something that sounded less like an invitation and more like a command. "After all, you clearly love this piano so much. You know everything about it. Surely you can play something, even something simple, unless you were just pretending to know all those things." A few people in the audience laughed. Not kind laughter, the other kind. Roberto closed his eyes. He could feel 45 years pressing down on him. 45 years of silence, 45 years of hiding, 45 years of running away from the thing he loved most in the world because it hurt too much to face it. He thought about his wife, her smile, the way she used to sit beside him on the piano bench. Even though she did not know how to play, she just liked being close to him when he made music. He thought about his daughter, her tiny hands clapping, her voice asking him to play the song about the butterfly one more time. Please, just one more time. He thought about the boy he used to be, the prodigy from the small village in Portugal, the genius who was going to conquer the world. That boy had died in a car crash along with everyone he loved. Roberto had been telling himself that for 45 years. But now, standing in that spotlight with 2,000 strangers staring at him, he was not so sure anymore. Maybe that boy was still in there somewhere. Maybe he had just been sleeping, waiting. Roberto opened his eyes. He reached up and removed his cap. He handed it to his supervisor, who looked at him like he had lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe this was the craziest thing he had ever done. But something inside him had shifted, something that had been locked away for so long that he had forgotten it existed. He started walking toward the stage. The audience went quiet. Really quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people realize they might be witnessing something they did not expect. Roberto's footsteps echoed through the hall. Every step felt like 100 miles. He could see Alexander on the stage, still smiling that cold smile, so confident that he was about to humiliate an old man for the entertainment of his audience. But as Roberto climbed the stairs to the stage, something strange happened. His hands stopped shaking. His heartbeat slowed. The fear that had been choking him began to fade away, replaced by something else. Calm. A deep, steady calm that he had not felt in 45 years. He walked past Alexander without looking at him. He walked across the stage, past the microphone, past the cameras, until he reached the piano. The Steinway Model D, built in 1927, the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen. Roberto pulled out the bench and sat down. The keys stretched out in front of him, white and black, waiting. He raised his hands and held them over the keyboard. They hovered there, trembling slightly, inches away from the ivory. 2,000 people held their breath. Alexander stood to the side, arms crossed, smirk still in place. He was expecting something funny, something sad. An old man fumbling through a simple tune, embarrassing himself in front of the whole world. He was not expecting what happened next. Roberto closed his eyes one more time. He thought about his wife, his daughter, the life he had lost, and the years he had wasted. He thought about all the music that had been trapped inside him, silent and screaming for nearly half a century. Then he let his finger fall on a single key, and that single note changed everything. The note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. It was just one note, a single key pressed by a single finger. But the sound that came out of that piano was something nobody in that concert hall expected. It was not the hesitant, clumsy sound of an amateur. It was not the nervous plinking of someone who had never touched a piano before. It was perfect, rich and deep, and full of something that words cannot describe. The kind of sound that reaches into your chest and grabs hold of your heart. The kind of sound that only comes from someone who truly understands what music is supposed to be. Alexander's smirk flickered, just for a moment, just enough to notice. Roberto kept his eyes closed. He did not see the confused looks in the audience. He did not see the cameras zooming in on his weathered hands. He did not see Alexander's face beginning to change from amusement to something else. He just played. His left hand joined his right, and suddenly the single note became a chord. Then another chord. Then a melody began to emerge, soft at first like a whisper, like a secret being told for the first time in 45 years. Roberto had chosen Chopin. Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. Professional musicians practiced it for years before attempting to perform it in public. Some never mastered it at all. The piece required not just technical skill but emotional depth. The ability to tell a story without words, to take an audience on a journey through joy and sorrow and everything in between. It was the last piece Roberto had played before his world fell apart. The piece he was supposed to perform the night his wife and daughter never made it to the concert hall. He had not played it since. He had not played anything since. Until now. The opening notes filled the hall like water filling an empty vessel. Soft and gentle, almost fragile, like the first light of morning creeping through a window. People in the audience leaned forward in their seats. The whispers stopped. The confused looks faded. Something was happening, something unexpected, and everyone could feel it. Roberto's fingers moved across the keys like they had never stopped. 45 years of silence, and yet his hands remembered everything. Every note, every phrase, every tiny detail that separated a good performance from a great one. It was like riding a bicycle, people always said. You never really forget. But this was more than muscle memory. This was something deeper. This was a man pouring out his soul through 88 keys, letting go of decades of grief and guilt and loneliness all at once. The melody grew stronger. The tempo increased. Roberto's hands danced across the keyboard, moving so fast they became a blur. The music swelled and crashed like waves against rocks, powerful and unstoppable. Then it would pull back, becoming soft again, tender, almost unbearably beautiful. In the front row, a music critic stopped writing. Her pen hovered over her notebook, forgotten. She had reviewed hundreds of concerts in her career. She had heard the greatest pianists in the world, but she had never heard anything like this. A woman in the third row began to cry. She did not know why. She did not know this old man or his story. But something in the music reached inside her and found a sadness she did not even know she was carrying. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she did not bother to wipe them away. She was not the only one. All across the hall, people were having the same experience. The music was doing something to them, breaking down walls they had built, opening doors they had kept locked. It was like Roberto was not just playing notes, but speaking directly to each person's heart. Alexander stood frozen at the side of the stage. His arms were no longer crossed. They hung at his sides, limp and useless. His face had gone pale. He stared at the old man at the piano, the janitor in the faded uniform, and he could not understand what he was seeing. This was impossible. This could not be real. A cleaner, a nobody, playing Chopin like this? Playing it better than Alexander himself had ever played it? It did not make sense. It was not fair. But the music did not care about fair. The music just kept coming. Roberto reached the heart of the piece, the part that always broke him when he was young, the part that spoke of loss so deep it could never be healed. His fingers slowed. The notes became sparse, each one hanging in the air like a teardrop about to fall. The silence between the notes was almost as powerful as the notes themselves. He thought about his wife, the way she laughed, the way she believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. She had told him once that his music was a gift, not just to the world, but to her. "When you play," she said, "I can hear how much you love us." He thought about his daughter, 5 years old, the last time he saw her. She had been wearing a blue dress with white flowers, her favorite dress. She had twirled around in it that morning, showing off for him, asking if she looked pretty enough for the concert. "You look perfect," he had told her. "The most beautiful girl in the whole world." That was the last thing he ever said to her. The music swelled again, building toward the climax. Roberto's hands flew across the keys with a power that surprised even him. Where was this coming from? He was 63 years old. His fingers were stiff from years of mopping floors and scrubbing toilets. He had not touched a piano in almost half a century. But none of that mattered. The music had been waiting inside him all this time, patient and faithful, ready to come out whenever he was finally brave enough to let it. The final section arrived, the hardest part of the piece. Notes cascading like a waterfall, fast and furious and demanding everything a pianist had to give. Roberto's hands moved with a speed and precision that defied logic. Sweat appeared on his forehead. His whole body swayed with the rhythm. He was not just playing the piano anymore. He was the piano. He was the music. And then, the final chord. Roberto brought his hands down on the keys with all the strength he had left. The sound exploded through the hall, filling every corner, every seat, every heart. It was triumph and tragedy all at once, joy and sorrow mixed together until you could not tell them apart. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Roberto's hands remained on the keys, trembling now. His eyes were still closed. Tears were streaming down his face, falling onto the ivory keys, mixing with the sweat on his fingers. He did not move. He could not move. He had given everything he had, every piece of himself that he had kept hidden for 45 years. The silence stretched on. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then the concert hall erupted. 2,000 people rose to their feet at once. The applause was not just loud, it was deafening. It was the kind of applause that shakes the walls and rattles the chandeliers. People were cheering, people were crying, people were hugging strangers next to them, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. Roberto finally opened his eyes. He looked out at the audience, at the sea of faces on their feet, at the standing ovation that showed no signs of stopping. He looked confused at first, like he did not understand what was happening. Then he looked to his left, where Alexander Richter was still standing. The famous pianist had not moved. His face was white as paper. His mouth hung open slightly. And in his eyes, Roberto saw something he had never expected to see. Fear. Alexander Richter, the man who thought he was the greatest pianist alive, had just watched an old janitor prove him wrong, in front of 2,000 people. In front of television cameras broadcasting to millions around the world. The applause continued. It would not stop. People were stomping their feet, calling out for more, chanting words that Roberto could not quite make out. The sound washed over him like a wave, like a baptism, like a second chance he never thought he would get. He had been invisible for 45 years. Not anymore. The standing ovation lasted for almost 6 minutes. 6 minutes of thunderous applause, of tears, of people shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. 6 minutes that changed everything. Roberto sat at the piano bench, unable to move. His hands were still resting on the keys, trembling slightly. The tears had stopped, but his cheeks were still wet. He felt empty in the best possible way, like a storm had passed through him and washed away years of dust and darkness. Finally, slowly, he stood up. His legs felt weak, like he had just run a marathon. He turned to face the audience, this sea of strangers who were now on their feet for him. For him. The janitor, the invisible man, the ghost who had been haunting this concert hall for 11 years. He did not know what to do. He had forgotten how to accept applause. So he did the only thing that felt right. He bowed. A simple bow, humble and graceful, the same bow he used to give when he was young and the world was still full of possibilities. The crowd roared even louder. Backstage, chaos was erupting. The concert hall director was on the phone with someone, speaking rapidly in German. Journalists were pushing against the security guards, demanding to know who the old man was. Camera operators were calling their studios, telling them to keep broadcasting. This was the story of the year. And Alexander Richter stood alone in the corner, watching it all fall apart. His concert was supposed to be the headline. His name was supposed to be in all the newspapers tomorrow. His face was supposed to be on every screen, every website, every magazine cover. Instead, everyone was talking about the janitor. The old man he had tried to humiliate had stolen his spotlight without even trying. Alexander wanted to be angry. He wanted to hate Roberto for ruining his night, for making him look foolish in front of the whole world. But he could not, because underneath the jealousy and the wounded pride, there was something else, something he had not felt in a very long time. Respect, real, genuine respect. Alexander had spent his whole life surrounded by talented musicians. He had competed against the best, studied with the best, performed alongside the best. But what Roberto had just done was different. That was not just talent. That was something deeper, something that could not be taught or practiced or bought with expensive lessons. That was soul. The applause finally began to fade. Roberto walked off the stage on shaky legs, not sure where he was going or what would happen next. He just wanted to find somewhere quiet, somewhere he could sit down and try to understand what he had just done. But before he could reach the exit, someone stepped in front of him. Alexander. The two men stood face to face, the famous virtuoso and the anonymous cleaner, the man who had everything and the man who had lost everything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander did something nobody expected. He extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all the arrogance and showmanship. He sounded like a different person. "What I did out there was cruel. I wanted to embarrass you. I wanted to prove that I was better than everyone, even a janitor who knew too much about pianos." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." Roberto looked at the outstretched hand. Then he looked at Alexander's face. The coldness was gone. The smirk was gone. What remained was something raw and honest and almost painful to see. Roberto took his hand. "I forgive you," he said simply. That was when the journalists broke through. The next few hours were a blur. Microphones were shoved in Roberto's face. Cameras flashed so bright he could barely see. Everyone wanted to know who he was, where he came from, why he had stopped playing, why he had been cleaning floors instead of performing on stages. The story came out piece by piece. Someone found old newspaper articles from Portugal. Someone else discovered recordings from his competition days, grainy videos that had been sitting in archives for decades. By morning, the whole world knew the truth. Roberto Oliveira had been one of the greatest piano prodigies of his generation. He had won international competitions. He had been called a genius, a once-in-a-lifetime talent, the future of classical music. And then he had disappeared, swallowed by grief after a tragedy that took away everyone he loved. For 45 years, he had been hiding in plain sight, cleaning the same concert halls where he should have been performing, listening to other pianists play the music that lived inside him, punishing himself for surviving when his wife and daughter did not. The video of his performance went viral within hours. It was shared millions of times across every platform. People who had never cared about classical music watched it and cried. Famous musicians posted about it, calling it one of the most moving performances they had ever seen. The hashtag started trending worldwide, but Roberto did not care about any of that. He did not care about the fame or the attention or the millions of views. He cared about something else entirely. For the first time in 45 years, he felt free. The weight he had been carrying, the guilt and the grief and the silence, it was still there. It would always be there. But it was lighter now. The music had done something to it, had transformed it into something he could live with instead of something that was slowly killing him. 3 months later, Roberto performed his first official concert since 1980. It was held in the same Vienna concert hall where everything had changed. Every seat was filled. People had flown in from around the world just to be there. The tickets had sold out in less than a minute, but the most surprising guest was sitting in the front row. Alexander Richter. He had reached out to Roberto a few weeks after that fateful night. Not for publicity, not for his career, but because he genuinely wanted to learn. The experience had changed him. Watching Roberto play had shown him something he had been missing in his own music, something he desperately wanted to find. They had become friends. An unlikely pair, the arrogant virtuoso and the humble janitor, but somehow it worked. Alexander visited Roberto at his small apartment. They talked about music for hours. Sometimes they played together on Roberto's old upright piano, the same one he had bought to replace the piano his grandmother had left behind. Alexander learned things from Roberto that no teacher had ever taught him. Not technique or theory, but something more important. How to feel the music instead of just playing it. How to let go of ego and ambition and just be present with each note. How to make a piano sing instead of just making sounds. And Roberto learned something too. He learned that it was not too late, that 45 years of silence did not have to be the end of his story. That the music had never really left him, it had just been waiting for him to be ready. The concert hall fell silent as Roberto walked onto the stage. He was not wearing a faded uniform anymore. He was wearing a simple black suit. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. He looked like exactly what he was. An old man who had lost everything and somehow found his way back. He sat down at the piano. The same Steinway Model D built in 1927. The most beautiful instrument he had ever known. He placed his hands on the keys. And then Roberto Oliveira began to play. Not for fame, not for applause, not for the millions of people who would watch the recording later. He played for his wife. He played for his daughter. He played for the boy he used to be and the man he had become. He played because music was the only language that could say what words never could, and somewhere, somehow, he knew they were listening.